We see pirates in battle. Swords flash, cannons roar, and the black flag strikes terror. Who was the most feared person on this ship? The captain, whose word was absolute law? The boatswain, who maintained order with the lash of a whip? Or the enemy, boarding with an axe in hand? The answer shatters this heroic image to its core. The most dangerous person to a sick or wounded pirate was one of their own comrades, the ship's carpenter or the cook. It was their desperate attempts at treatment that most often led to an agonizing death. They didn't save lives. They killed with infection, blood loss, and the unbearable shock of pain. The carpenter, whose hands were accustomed to rough wood and hot tar, not living, trembling flesh, would lean over a fellow crewmate, and the only sound that drowned out the screams was the screech of rusty metal against bone. How is it possible that a savior could become an executioner? This presents us with the first of two key questions. On a ship full of battle-hardened men, where strength and survival were valued above all else, why did the most dangerous person turn out to be not an enemy, but the doctor, a comrade whose treatment was fatal? We will find the answer to this question in the 7th section, and here is the second, even larger paradox. How do we explain the fact that scurvy, the disease of rotting gums, killed over 2 million sailors? This is tens of times more than all naval battles, storms, and cannonballs combined. 2 million dead. It's as if the entire population of Paris at that time was wiped off the face of the earth, not by bullets, but by the simple lack of fruit. These two questions separate the Hollywood myth from brutal reality, and it is into that reality we will now descend. By the end of this video, you will no longer see the pirates from Treasure Island as romantic adventurers. You will see them as tragic, doomed figures, men trapped on a wooden vessel in the middle of a merciless ocean. They faced an enemy they couldn't run from, couldn't bribe, and couldn't intimidate. They faced their own bodies, which betrayed them from within. You will understand why a throbbing toothache was more terrifying than any storm, and why the most coveted treasure wasn't a chest of gold, but the chance of a quick death from a bullet rather than a slow, humiliating agony from treatment. A toothache on a ship was like a slow fire in the hold. At first, it's just a faint, barely noticeable wisp of smoke you can ignore, but soon it erupts into an uncontrollable blaze, threatening to destroy the entire ship from the inside out. And so you know when to expect the key revelations. Here is a map of our brutal journey. We will guide you through 3 key points of this floating hell. In just 9 minutes, we will reveal how gunpowder and rum, the main symbols of pirate life, became tools of desperate and deadly anesthesia. In 15 minutes, you will see with your own eyes why the ship's carpenter, armed with ordinary rusty pliers, was the most feared man on board, and you will witness his operation in detail. And in 21 minutes, we will prove that it wasn't the toothache itself, but this barbaric treatment that was the leading cause of death for pirates with dental problems. Our investigation begins now, and the first enemy we will confront was invisible, merciless, and killed by the millions. Let's start with the first and greatest killer at sea, one that today is cured with simple oranges. A disease that is now treated with a glass of orange juice killed over 2 million sailors. How is this possible? The answer lies in collagen. A lack of vitamin C halted its production, and collagen is the glue that holds our bodies together. The gums were the first to fail. They would begin to bleed, and teeth would loosen. But here is what the ship's logs hide. It wasn't just the gums that deteriorated. Long-healed wounds from swords and bullets would reopen and begin to fester, as if the injury had happened just yesterday. The loss of collagen worked like soil erosion. First, cracks appeared in the gums. Then, entire layers crumbled away as old wounds reopened. Eventually, the body's entire structure would collapse. A pirate's mouth turned into an open, bleeding wound, the perfect gateway for any infection. Scurvy prepared the ground for the next enemy. But what if a pirate was lucky enough to avoid it? That didn't save him from another, more localized and brutal form of torture. Why did a diet of rock-hard biscuits and tough salted meat not strengthen pirates' teeth, but instead grind them down to powder? Food debris, and most importantly, The sugar from the daily ration of rum created the perfect environment for bacteria. A complete lack of hygiene sealed the deal. The picture changes when we understand that on an isolated ship, a cavity wasn't just a hole. It was a constant source of infection that could develop into an abscess, a pocket of pus at the root of the tooth, in a matter of days. The pain became a throbbing agony, robbing a man of sleep and sanity. It took less than a week to go from a developing abscess to sepsis, a total blood infection. In a world without antibiotics, this was a guaranteed death sentence, more certain than a musket ball to the chest. It was this countdown that forced pirates to become alchemists of despair. What would make a battle-hardened man who didn't fear death beg for help over a simple tooth? At first, he would try to ignore it. He'd numb the pain with rum, clench his jaw, and continue hauling ropes. But reality hit with full force. The pain became a pulsating hammer blow to his jaw, in time with every beat of his heart. He couldn't sleep. He couldn't eat. He couldn't focus. On a ship where every cog in the machine had to function, he quickly transformed from an asset into a useless burden. He faced a cruel choice: either continue to endure the agony and risk being put ashore, or voluntarily submit to the unimaginable torture of treatment. His first step on this path led him to the ship's chest, which held the 3 primary remedies. Scurvy and cavities were not just diseases. They were a countdown to death or complete disability. In the total medical isolation of the open ocean, desperation fueled ingenuity. Pirates created their own brutal pharmacology from what was always on hand. It was an alchemy of pain based on 3 components: rum, tobacco, and gunpowder. The very symbols of pirate life became desperate attempts to conquer agony. We have seen the disease. Now we will see the cure that was more terrifying than the disease itself. How was rum, the pirates' main drink, both a cause of the disease and the first line of defense against it? Poison became medicine. The logic seemed sound. Alcohol dulls pain. A pirate would rinse his mouth or drink it straight, achieving temporary numbness. The high alcohol content created the illusion of disinfection. But in practice, the opposite was true. The relief was short-lived, and the pain returned with a vengeance. Achieving the same effect required ever larger doses, turning the sailor into an incapacitated liability. The final act of desperation was to try cauterizing the gum with undiluted rum. This caused a chemical burn on the mucous membrane, which, instead of healing, created a new gateway for infection. It was like trying to extinguish smoldering embers by dousing them with gasoline. When liquid fire no longer helped, they turned to a poisonous plant. Where did the belief that tobacco, chewed for pleasure, could also heal come from? What made them see it as a medical remedy? Nicotine does have a mild analgesic effect. A pirate would place a wad of chewing tobacco directly on the aching tooth, and the pain would indeed subside slightly. It seemed like a working folk remedy. But this temporary relief concealed a catastrophe. The tar and alkali in the tobacco destroyed the already damaged enamel. In the long run, this treatment only accelerated the disease. The most dangerous aspect was different. They would pack the moist tobacco mash directly into the cavity. This caused a chemical burn that killed the nerve. The pain vanished, but the tooth turned into a ticking time bomb, a core of dead tissue where an abscess could develop unchecked. But even this was not the most insane method. The most shocking approach involved the primary tool of pirate combat. Pirates tried to treat a tooth by igniting gunpowder inside it. What drove them to such a desperate measure? What logic of despair was behind this? The theory was radical. Gunpowder consists of saltpeter, sulfur, and charcoal, components with cauterizing properties. The idea was to use a micro-explosion to instantly burn out the nerve and sterilize the cavity. The reality was torture. The burning temperature of black powder reaches 3,600 degrees Fahrenheit, twice as hot as lava. The thermal expansion would instantly shatter the weakened tooth down to the root. The pain became hellish. But besides shattering the tooth, the method caused severe burns to the gums, tongue, and cheek. Instead of one problem, the pirate now had 3, all of which were open gateways for gangrene. When this infernal alchemy also failed, a desperate gaze turned to the man with the crudest tools on the ship. Rum, tobacco, and gunpowder were not cures. They were illusions that worsened the disease. They masked symptoms and added new injuries, chemical burns, hidden abscesses, and fractured teeth. The pain would return, becoming unbearable. All available medicines had been tried and had failed. The pirate was left with no choice. The next step was a shift from self-medication to radical intervention. But there was no operating room on the ship. Its role was filled by the carpenter's workshop. Desperation had reached its peak. Now, the pirate had to entrust his life not to medicine, but to brute force and rusty metal. On a ship where sharp, reliable weapons were the key to survival, why were the dirtiest tools used to save a life? The carpenter's workshop smelled of salt, damp wood, and tar. The instruments taken for the operation were cold, heavy, and sticky, with a mixture of machine oil and wood shavings, a perfect breeding ground for bacteria. The logic of desperation was simple. Pliers designed for pulling nails and a chisel for working with wood were the only tools capable of applying brute force. But this adaptation was a death sentence. The tools weren't just unsterile. They were covered in rust, resin, and old blood, guaranteeing the introduction of tetanus and gangrene into the open wound. Their main problem was their very nature. They were designed to destroy hard materials, not for delicate work on living tissue. The pliers crushed the tooth, and the chisel broke the jaw, and the most fearsome tool required the strongest man on the ship. Trying to extract an aching tooth with carpenter's pliers is like trying to unscrew a fragile glass light bulb from its socket with a wrench. The result is predictable. The glass will shatter into fragments, leaving the base stuck inside. The carpenter would attempt to grip the tooth's crown with the wide, flat jaws of the pliers and rock it back and forth. But the crown, weakened by decay, would instantly crumble under the pressure. What remained in the mouth were razor-sharp shards of the roots, which were now impossible to grasp. The pain intensified tenfold. Next came the chisel. It was placed at the base of the shattered tooth and struck with a mallet, in a literal attempt to knock the remnants out of the jaw. This often led to a longitudinal fracture of the jawbone, turning a simple extraction into a complex trauma. This brutal process required not only tools, but also a man willing to become an executioner. Why was it the carpenter, whose job was to build and repair, to create, who was forced to perform the most destructive work on board? He was chosen not for his knowledge, but for his raw physical strength. He had the strongest hands on the ship, capable of holding down a man writhing in agony. But behind this pragmatism lay a human tragedy. The carpenter was a comrade to the patient. He saw the pleading in his friend's eyes and understood that he was about to inflict hellish pain and possibly kill him with infection. To refuse meant certain death for his friend from sepsis. For him, the most terrifying thing was not the scream, but the moment of silence after the crack of bone, the moment he didn't know if he had broken just the tooth or the entire jaw, whether he had become a savior or a murderer. Thus, the toolkit became a set of torture implements, and the procedure became an act of destruction. We have witnessed the psychological drama of a man forced to mutilate his friend to save him. But what if even this hell didn't work? What if the tooth wouldn't yield to pliers or chisel, and the jaw cracked under the hammer's blows? In the arsenal of desperation, there remained one last, most unthinkable and shocking method. On the ship, there was no anesthesia and no sterility. So what did the preparation for this torture look like? It was a ritual that created the illusion of control. The patient was plied with rum until he was semi-conscious. 4 of the strongest sailors pinned him to the deck, their task to prevent him from breaking his own bones in convulsions. The carpenter would make a show of wiping the pliers with the same rum, simulating disinfection. But this was mere decoration. The alcohol dulled consciousness, but not the pain. The patient felt everything. His screams were so horrific that a leather gag was forced into his mouth. This was not an operation. It was a well-organized torture session. And just before it began, the patient's gaze would meet the carpenter's. It was a silent contract, an agreement to endure torment for a minuscule chance of survival, an act of supreme trust born from absolute despair. But sometimes this role was taken not by the strongest man, but by the one most experienced with flesh. Besides the carpenter, why was the ship's cook often chosen for the role of surgeon? The logic seemed pragmatic. The cook worked with knives every day, butchering carcasses. He handled bones, meat, and sinews. In a world without doctors, this was the closest qualification to surgical skill. However, it was this very experience that made him the worst possible physician. The cook was accustomed to working with dead flesh, not a living, screaming person. His movements were not healing, but carving, crude, sharp, and aimed at dismemberment. His butchering knife was guaranteed to carry bacteria for tetanus, E. coli, and gas gangrene. It wasn't a blade, it was a biological weapon. It was often the cook who made deep incisions in the gums, trying to expose the tooth's root. And with that motion, he introduced a deadly infection directly into the bloodstream. But there was a method that required neither the strong hands of the carpenter nor the knife of the cook, only insane courage. How could a pistol, a weapon of murder, become a surgical instrument? The idea was radical in its simplicity. A strong sinew was tied to the aching tooth. The other end was attached to a bullet loaded into a pistol. The gunshot was supposed to yank the tooth out at high speed. In practice, however, this method was a catastrophe. The sinew almost always snapped, or only a piece of the crown would be ripped out, leaving sharp fragments in the gum. Worst of all, the bullet's trajectory could change, hitting the cheek or tongue. The force of the pull from a flintlock pistol bullet is equivalent to the impact of a 330-pound hammer. This is enough not just to pull a tooth, but to shatter the jaw. Even if the tooth came out, the searing hot gunpowder gases would burn the entire oral cavity. And all these methods, from pliers to pistols, led to the same end. We have delved into the psychological hell of the operation. We have seen how friends became executioners. We have examined the three main methods: the brute force of the carpenter, the butchering skills of the cook, and the insane ingenuity with a pistol. But all of this was merely a prelude. The extraction of a tooth, or the attempt, was not the end of suffering, but the beginning of the most dangerous stage. The central question of our investigation is not how a pirate's tooth was pulled, but what happened in the days that followed, after he was left, bloodied and traumatized, alone with a gaping wound in his mouth. The most terrible truth will now be revealed. We will learn what happened next. This is the real killer. Hours earlier, the carpenter's pliers had already failed. The toothache, intensified by the trauma of the botched attempt, had become a solid wall of agony, and so the pirate asked for one last thing, a mercy shot. He saw the pistol not as a weapon, but as salvation. The logic of despair was simple. It was better to risk instant death from a bullet than to be guaranteed several more days of torture. It was an illusion of control. One sharp impact, one moment, and it would all be over. He felt the cold, heavy metal of the flintlock pistol against his swollen cheek and smelled the acrid scent of cheap rum on his own breath. A roar, smoke, shock. The bullet didn't knock out the tooth. It shattered his jaw and tore through his cheek. Instead of relief, the pirate got double the torment. The pain from the tooth now merged with the pain of a gunshot wound. He clutched his mangled cheek, a fragment of bone protruding. From it, pain had triumphed over the instinct for self-preservation. But why this method was physically doomed to fail, we will now understand. The theoretical physics of this method was brutal and primitive. Pirates believed that the ultra-fast, powerful jerk from the bullet would overcome the ligament's resistance and pull the tooth out cleanly, without letting it break. It was a bet on brute force against anatomy. But a tooth is not a nail. Its curved, strong roots are set deep in the jawbone. All the energy of the shot, applied to the crown, almost always broke it at its weakest point. It was like trying to open a locked door by pulling on the very tip of the key in the lock. All the force went not into turning the mechanism, but into breaking the key itself. The method guaranteed not an extraction, but the creation of a large, ragged wound contaminated with gunpowder gases. The powder residue was driven directly into the shattered bone. This wasn't treatment. It was the creation of an incubator for a fatal infection. And we know this is not just a tall tale. We have proof. How do we know this isn't just a story meant to frighten? Ship's logs are full of euphemistic entries like lost jaw in a storm, or unfortunate accident with a musket. These were phrases that concealed a brutal reality. But the real truth is revealed by paleopathology. Archaeological findings of sailors' skulls from that era show characteristic injuries, healed and unhealed jaw fractures that cannot be explained by combat wounds or falls from a mast. This is direct physical evidence. In one 18th-century sailor burial site, 3 out of 11 examined skulls showed non-combat jaw fractures. A modern scientist, pointing to a fine crack in an ancient bone, confirms this was a victory of desperation over reason. The mercy shot was not just one of the methods. It was the logical conclusion of a path that began with a rum rinse. The failure of the desperate alchemy of tobacco and gunpowder led to the crude surgery of the carpenter and the cook, and the unbearableness of that surgery gave rise to an act of suicidal desperation, the pistol shot. This proves that pirates were willing to do absolutely anything to stop the pain. But all these interventions, different in form but identical in essence, led to the same outcome, and that outcome was not a cure. It was the creation of perfect conditions for the real killer. Here is the answer to the question we asked at the very beginning. The most dangerous person on the ship was not an enemy, but a comrade, the doctor. Pirates didn't die from a toothache. They died from sepsis, tetanus, and gangrene, introduced by their own crewmates in the process of saving them. After the tooth or its remnants were torn out, severe bleeding would begin. To stop it, the wound was cauterized with a red-hot iron or packed with gunpowder. The logic seemed flawless. Stop the blood and burn out the infection with fire. But an open wound in the mouth, the filth from the pliers, and the deep burn from cauterization were not a risk of infection. They were a 100% guarantee of it. The red-hot iron, at a temperature of 1,300 degrees Fahrenheit, created the perfect oxygen-free environment for tetanus to thrive. The treatment was the fatal disease. But this death was not quick. For the first day or two, the pirate felt relief. The source of unbearable pain was gone. It seemed the operation was a success. But this was the calm before the storm. After 2 or 3 days, a fever, chills, and shivering would set in. His face would swell, and the wound would fester. The pain returned, but now it was not sharp and localized, but a dull, all-encompassing ache. The body was entering a losing war against infection. Death came in agony 5 to 7 days later. The pirate couldn't open his mouth due to trismus, the spasming of jaw muscles from tetanus. He died of suffocation and blood poisoning. He had chosen torture to survive, but he got both torture and a death far more terrible. And this individual tragedy was part of a much larger mechanism. Why did more than 2 million sailors die from scurvy? We associate it with losing teeth, but that's just the tip of the iceberg. Scurvy causes a total collapse of the immune system. An organism deprived of vitamin C loses its ability to fight any infection and heal wounds. A pirate's body, weakened by scurvy, was completely defenseless against the bacteria introduced by the carpenter's rusty pliers. This created a fail-proof assembly line of death. Scurvy led to dental problems. Dental problems led to barbaric surgery. And surgery performed on a body weakened by scurvy was guaranteed to result in fatal sepsis. A pirate's body was like a powder keg, and the treatment was the spark that caused the explosion. We have uncovered the central mystery. Pirates were waging a war not against pain, but against their own ignorance. It wasn't the disease that killed them, but the cure. And this knowledge changes everything. The image of the fearless adventurer, afraid of neither sword nor bullet, crumbles to dust. In his place emerges a tragic figure, a man cornered by pain, forced to entrust his life to ignorant, unwilling executioners. This is a story not of strength, but of ultimate vulnerability. We have seen a world where knowledge was absent, and the price was life. In the finale, we will understand the value this knowledge holds for us today. A toothache was not an isolated problem. It was an inevitable symptom of a total health collapse built into the very structure of life at sea. It was a perfect storm where a systemic disease and a localized infection worked in tandem. Scurvy, caused by a lack of vitamin C, weakened the gums and crippled the immune system. Simultaneously, cavities attacked the teeth themselves. The daily rum ration contained the equivalent of 10 sugar cubes, creating an ideal environment for bacteria. Every sailor who went to sea was doomed to face this double blow. This turned every ship into a floating powder keg. Have you ever put off a visit to the doctor out of fear or lack of time, hoping it would just go away? A pirate's path to salvation was a tragic ladder of escalation, where each subsequent step was more desperate and dangerous than the last. It all began with alchemy, attempts to numb the pain with rum and tobacco or burn out the nerve with gunpowder. The failure of these methods didn't stop them but only strengthened their resolve. This inevitably led to surgery. The transition to carpenter's pliers and a chisel was an act of desperation, when enduring the pain became impossible. The mercy shot from a pistol was the peak of this escalation, when even the torture of surgery became unbearable. This escalation resembled soil erosion. The first attempt at treatment was just a small stream, but each failure washed away the banks, relentlessly turning it into a deadly ravine. Their intention was to save a comrade from pain, but the result of their actions was his death. In this struggle for survival, the pirates' main enemy was not a storm or an enemy fleet. It was a complete lack of knowledge about hygiene, anatomy, and microbiology. The entire chain of tragedy was built on this foundation. Systemic disease and poor conditions created toothaches. The pain led to desperate attempts at treatment, and the ignorant methods, dirty tools, and disregard for anatomy inevitably led to fatal infection. The irony is that Louis Pasteur's germ theory, which could have saved them all, would not appear for another 150 years after the end of the golden age of piracy. We live in a world built on the knowledge for which they paid with their lives. This is their brutal legacy. We have shown you a world where simple knowledge of microbes could have saved thousands of lives, but it did not exist. Now you know this story. Thank you for following this journey from romantic myth to brutal truth. After everything you have learned, answer with one word. What was more terrifying for a pirate? The toothache itself, or the treatment from a comrade? Write pain or treatment in the comments. Let's see which choice the majority makes and discuss why.